the beginning. Hi, it's Safti. Saba's going to read to you, but I just wanted to get everything started. Okay, here he is. Don't close out.
Good afternoon. It's been quite a few weeks since I've read anything from Treasure Island. The last few weeks have been a very stormy voyage for us. And I've tried a couple of times, several times, to read, but I've been unsuccessful at getting YouTube to accept the reading. Now we'll start with Treasure Island, Chapter 24, The Cruise of the Coracle. As you'll recall, Jim had found the little boat that that man on the island that he ran into, the lone stranger on the island that he ran into, and he found it under the white rock where he had been told it would be. He took it out, he went out into the lagoon there where the ship, the Hispaniola, was anchored, and he cut the anchor rope so that the ship drifted off. Then he himself fell asleep and ended up being kind of washed out or drifted out to sea on the tide as it went out from the lagoon. Chapter 24, The Cruise of the Coracle. It was broad day when I awoke and found myself tossing at the southwest end of Treasure Island. The sun was up, but was still hid from me behind the great bulk of the spyglass, which on this side descended almost to the sea in formidable cliffs. Hull Bolan Head and Mizzenmast Hill were at my elbow. Right near him, he was just offshore. The hill bare and dark, the head bound with cliffs 40 or 50 feet high and fringed with great masses of fallen rock. I was scarce a quarter of a mile to seaward, that is, out to sea by a quarter of a mile, or about 300, 400 yards or meters, and it was my first thought to paddle in and land. That notion was soon given over. Among the fallen rocks, the breakers spouted and bellowed, loud reverberations, heavy sprays flying and falling succeeded one another from second to second, and I saw myself, if I ventured nearer, dashed to death upon the rough shore, or spending my strength in vain to scale the beetling crags. Nor was that all, for crawling together on flat tables of rock or letting themselves drop into the sea with loud reports, splashes, I beheld huge slimy monsters, soft snails as it were, of incredible bigness, 2 or 3 score of them together, making the rocks to echo with their barkings. I've understood since that they were sea lions and entirely harmless, and they can be up to over 2 to 3 meters in length and weigh about a ton or more. And they have nasty looking teeth, but they're only harmless to fish. But the look of them added to the difficulty of the shore, and the high running of the surf was more than enough to disgust me of that landing place. I felt willing rather to starve at sea than to confront such perils, and you will recall that he had just a little bit of food with him and no water, and you can't go to sea without water and without food because there ain't much out there. In the meantime, I had a better chance, as I suppose, before me. North of Hull Bolan Head, the land runs in a long way, leaving at low tide a long stretch of yellow sand. To the north of that, again, there comes another cape, Cape of the Woods, as it was marked upon the chart, and you'll remember I showed you that chart last time, buried in tall green pines, which descended to the margin of the sea. Down to the edge of the sea there was a kind of a forest of pine trees. I remembered what Silver had said about the current that sets northward along the whole west coast of Treasure Island. And seeing from my position that I was already under its influence, I preferred to leave Haulbowline Head behind me and reserve my strength for an attempt to land upon the kindlier-looking Cape of the Woods. There was a great smooth swell upon the sea, the wind blowing steady and gentle from the south. There was no contrariety between that and the current, and the billows rose and fell unbroken. Now, if you'll remember, Jim and the landing place where the mooring place where they had moored the ship and where they had landed was at the south end of Treasure Island. Jim had drifted out into sea towards the south, and the current had carried him up along the west coast of Treasure Island and was carrying him north, and the wind was helping. That was also blowing him. So between the wind and the current, he was making pretty good time going north. Had it been otherwise, I must long ago have perished, but as it was, it is surprising how easily and securely my little and light boat could ride. Often, as I lay still at the bottom and kept no more than an eye above the gunwale, I would see a big blue summit heaving close above me. Yet the Coracle would but bounce a little, dance as if on springs, and subside on the other side into the trough as lightly as a bird. Now, a wave has peaks and troughs, if you'll recall. Let's try that again, peaks and troughs. And his boat was running in the troughs between the peaks. So when he looked out, he could see the summits, the peaks of the waves. But the Coracle didn't ride up, it just rode between the waves. I began after a little to grow very bold and sat up to try my skill at paddling. But even a small change in the disposition of the weight will produce violent changes in the behavior of a coracle. And I had hardly moved before the boat, giving up at once her gentle dancing movement, ran straight down a slope of water so steep that it made me giddy, and struck her nose with a spout of spray deep into the side of the next wave, and the Coracle shipped water. I was drenched and terrified and fell instantly back into my old position, lying flat on the bottom of the Coracle, whereupon the Coracle seemed to find her head again and led me as softly as before among the billows. It was plain she was not to be interfered with, and at that rate, since I could in no way influence her course, what hope had I left of reaching land? I began to be horribly frightened, but I kept my head for all that. First, moving with all care, I gradually bailed out the Coracle with my sea cap. I got all the water out of it, poured it out back into the sea where it belonged. Then, getting my eye once more above the gunwale, I set myself to study how it was she managed to slip so quietly through the rollers. I found each wave, instead of the big, smooth, glossy mountain it looks from shore or from a vessel's deck, was for all the world like any range of hills on the dry land, full of peaks and smooth places and valleys. The Coracle, left to herself, turning from side to side, threaded, so to speak, her way through these lower parts, like a needle and thread through a piece of cloth, and avoided the steep slopes and higher, toppling summits of the waves. Well now, thought I to myself, it is plain I must lie where I am and not disturb the balance. But it is plain also that I can put the paddle over the side and from time to time in smooth places, give her a shove or two towards land. No sooner thought upon than done. There I lay on my elbows in a most trying attitude, and every now and again gave a weak stroke or two to turn her head to shore. It was very tiring and slow work, yet I did visibly gain ground. And as we drew near the Cape of the Woods, though I saw I must infallibly miss that point, I had still made some 100 yards of easting. So he was making way towards land, even though it was taking him a little longer than he had hoped. I was indeed close in. I could see the cool green treetops swaying together in the breeze, and I felt sure I should make the next promontory without fail. It was high time, for I now began to be tortured with thirst. The glow of the sun from above, its thousandfold reflection from the waves, the seawater that fell and dried upon me, caking my very lips with salt, combined to make my throat burn and my brain ache. The sight of the trees so near at hand had almost made me sick with longing, but the current had soon carried me past the point, and as the next reach of sea opened out, I beheld a sight that changed the nature of my thoughts. Right in front of me, not half a mile away, that's about 500 meters, I beheld the Hispaniola under sail. I made sure, of course, that I should be taken, but I was so distressed for want of water that I scarce knew whether to be glad or sorry at the thought, and long before I had come to a conclusion, surprise had taken entire possession of my mind, and I could do nothing but stare and wonder. Now, what was his dilemma? He wasn't sure. He was quite sure that if he got to the Hispaniola, whoever was on board would take him captive. But still, he needed water and food, even more than he was afraid of being a captive.
So you can take stop here for part one, whatever you want.
The Hispaniola was under her mainsail and two jibs. That is to say, she just had one big sail and then the two sails that come off for the front of the boat. And the beautiful white canvas of the sails shone in the sun like snow or silver. When I first sighted her, all her sails were drawing. She was lying a course about northwest, and I presumed the men on board were going round the island on their way back to the anchorage. Presently she began to fetch more and more to the westward, so that I thought they'd sighted me and were going about in chase, that they were turning around. Because he was going north, they were going north, they were going north and west, but now they started to veer back to the west. So at last, however, she fell right into the wind's eye, meaning she was right in where the wind was blowing directly at her, was taken dead aback, and stood there a while helpless with her sails shivering. In short, the sails were not in the wind. They weren't catching the wind, and the ship stopped moving, and just the sails were just shuddering. Clumsy fellows, said I, they must still be drunk as owls, and I thought how Captain Smollett would have set them skipping. He wouldn't have let them lie around drunk. Meanwhile, the schooner gradually fell off and filled again upon another tack, sailed swiftly for a minute or so, and brought up once more dead in the wind's eye. Again and again was this repeated, to and fro, up and down, north, south, east, west. The Hispaniola sailed by swoops and dashes, and at each repetition ended as she had begun, with idly flapping canvas. It became plain to me that nobody was steering, nobody was taking charge of the ship. And if so, where were the men? Either they were dead drunk, or had deserted her, I thought, and perhaps if I could get on board, I might return the vessel to her captain. The current was bearing Coracle and schooner southward at an equal rate. I think he means northward, because the current, as you'll recall, was running from south to north. So I have to read this. The current was bearing Coracle and schooner northward at an equal rate. As for the latter's sailing, that is the schooner, it was so wild and intermittent, and she hung each time so long in irons, meaning she just was hanging there, that she certainly gained nothing if she did not even lose. In short, she wasn't making any headway. If only I dared to sit up and paddle, I made sure that I could overhaul her. The scheme had an air of adventure that inspired me, and the thought of the water breaker, meaning the water cooler, the water jug, beside the fore companion doubled my growing courage. Up I got, was welcomed almost instantly by another cloud of spray, but this time stuck to my purpose and set myself with all my strength and caution to paddle after the unsteered Hispaniola. Once I shipped a sea so heavy that I had to stop and bail, with my heart fluttering like a bird, but gradually I got into the way of the thing and guided my coracle among the waves, with only now and then a blow upon her bows and a dash of foam in my face. I was now gaining rapidly on the schooner. I could see the brass glisten on the tiller. The tiller is the steering post, and the brass is the metal that of the steering wheel, and the brass handles on the tiller as it banged about, and still no soul appeared upon her decks. I could not choose but suppose she was deserted. If not, the men were lying drunk below, where I might batten them down perhaps, and do what I chose with the ship. Now, batten them down underneath the ship had a hold on below decks, below the top deck. And in order to prevent water from coming in, there were hatches with covers, and the cover would fit tightly over the hatch, which was a hole in the deck, and could be fastened down tightly so as to keep water out of the ship. Somehow one does not want water going inside the ship, right? Right. For some time she'd been doing the worst thing possible for me, standing still. She headed nearly due south, yawing, of course, all the time. That means going this way and this way. Each time she fell off, her sails partly filled, and these brought her in a moment right to the wind again. I've said that this was the worst thing possible for me, for helpless as she looked in this situation, with the canvas cracking like cannon and the blocks trundling and banging on the deck, she still continued to run away from me, not only with the speed of the current, but by the whole amount of her leeway, which was naturally great. So the ship had considerable momentum, and once it got moving, it took a lot to stop it. But now at last I had my chance. The breeze fell for some seconds very low, and the current gradually turning her, the Hispaniola revolved slowly round her center, and at last presented me her stern, with the cabin window still gaping open, and the lamp over the table still burning on into the day. The mainsail hung drooped like a banner, like a flag. She was stock still, but for the current. For the last little while I had even lost, but now redoubling my efforts, I began once more to overhaul the chase. I was not 100 yards from her when the wind came again in a clap. She filled on the port tack, going off to the left, and was off again, stooping and skimming like a swallow. My first impulse was one of despair, but my second was towards joy. Round she came till she was broadside on to me, round still till she'd covered a half. The ship is now slowly spinning around completely, and then 2/3 and then 3/4 of the distance that separated us. I could see the waves boiling white under her forefoot. That's under the bow of the ship. Immensely tall she looked to me from my low station in the coracle. And then of a sudden I began to comprehend. I'd scarce time to think, scarce time to act and save myself. I was on the summit of one swell when the schooner came swooping over the next. The bowsprit was over my head. I sprang to my feet and leaped, stamping the coracle under water. With one hand I caught the jib boom, while my foot was lodged between the stay and the brace, and as I still clung there panting, a dull blow told me that the schooner had charged down upon and struck the coracle, and that I was left without retreat on the Hispaniola. That's the end of chapter 24. We'll pick it up later.